For 50 years, the global economy rested on a single invisible handshake. It wasn't written in a public treaty, it wasn't debated in the United Nations, but it was the bedrock of the modern world. It was a simple arrangement made in the middle of the 20th century. The United States provides security, Saudi Arabia provides oil. And crucially, Saudi Arabia sells that oil exclusively in US dollars. That handshake built the American superpower. It made the dollar the king of currencies. It meant that if you wanted energy anywhere on Earth, you had to play by American rules. But recently, the handshake was broken. While the world was distracted by wars in Eastern Europe and inflation at home, a private jet touched down in Riyadh. A red carpet was rolled out, not for an American president, but for the leader of China. In quiet rooms, away from the Western press, signatures were dried on a new kind of contract. This wasn't just a trade deal, it was a realignment of the planet's economic spine. The Saudi-China Oil Pact isn't just about barrels of crude moving east. It is a systematic dismantling of the old world order. It involves secret currency swaps, massive technology transfers, and a geopolitical pivot that leaves the West scrambling to understand what just happened. Today, we are going inside the deal. We are going to show you how the flow of money has reversed, why the petrodollar is facing its first true executioner, and why the gas in your car is now a political weapon in a Cold War you didn't even know had started. This is the story of the alliance that changed everything. Let's back up. To understand the earthquake, we have to understand the ground it shook. To the average observer, an oil pact sounds boring. It sounds like accountants moving numbers on a spreadsheet. But in the world of high-stakes geopolitics, an oil pact is a marriage. And like any marriage, it is based on need. Countries form oil pacts for survival. If you are an industrial nation, oil is your blood. Without it, your factories stop, your trucks halt, your lights go out, and your government collapses within weeks. If you are a producer, like Saudi Arabia, oil is your currency. It is the only thing keeping your cities in the desert from being reclaimed by the sand. For decades, the marriage was between Washington and Riyadh. The deal was simple. The US had the biggest military, Saudi had the most oil. The US needed fuel, Saudi needed protection from its neighbors. But marriages fall apart when the needs change. Over the last 15 years, the United States did something unexpected. It started drilling its own oil. Thanks to the fracking boom, America became energy independent. Suddenly, Washington didn't need Saudi Arabia as much as it used to. At the same time, American politicians began asking uncomfortable questions about Saudi human rights records. The phone calls between the White House and the Royal Palace grew colder. The visits became less frequent. Saudi Arabia looked at the map and realized something terrifying. Their biggest protector was becoming their competitor. They were alone in a dangerous neighborhood, sitting on a pile of cash with no one to guard it. They needed a new partner. And looking east, they saw a giant that was hungry. The shift didn't happen overnight. It began with a slow, desperate hunger that started thousands of miles away from the Arabian sands. It started in the factories of Guangdong and the sprawling metropolises of Shanghai. By the early 2000s, China had become the factory of the world. But a factory needs power. China's appetite for energy was voracious, growing faster than any nation in human history. They were burning coal, but they needed oil to fuel the massive logistical network of trucks, ships, and planes that moved their goods to the West. China had a problem. They didn't have enough domestic oil. They were reliant on imports. And who controlled the seas through which those imports traveled? The United States Navy. Beijing realized that in any conflict with the West, the US could simply turn off the tap. They could blockade the shipping lanes, and the Chinese economy would suffocate. This is what strategists call the Malacca dilemma, the fear of being choked off at a narrow strait in Southeast Asia. China needed a guaranteed supply, a direct line that couldn't be cut. Enter the architects of the new alliance. On one side, you had the technocrats of Beijing. They play a long game. They don't think in 4-year election cycles, they think in 50-year plans. They launched the Belt and Road Initiative, a massive infrastructure project designed to physically link China to the resources it needs. On the other side, you had a new generation of Saudi leadership, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, known as MBS. MBS is not his grandfather. He isn't interested in maintaining the status quo. He wants to modernize Saudi Arabia, to diversify its economy before the oil runs out. He calls it Vision 2030. But to build futuristic cities in the desert, he needs money, and he needs technology. The US was hesitant to sell its best tech. China was willing to sell anything. The relationship started with small trades, a few million barrels here, a construction contract there. But as American rhetoric against Saudi Arabia heated up, the Saudi leadership saw an opening. China didn't ask questions about internal politics. China didn't lecture them on morality. China just paid the bill, on time and in full. Let's break down the mechanics of why this happened so fast. It comes down to three concepts: energy security, strategic autonomy, and the petrodollar. Energy security is simple. China needs to know the lights will stay on. Saudi Arabia offers that stability. Strategic autonomy is the desire to not be bullied by the West. By allying with each other, both nations gained leverage over Washington. But the big one? The petrodollar. Since the 1970s, Saudi Arabia sold oil only in US dollars. This meant every country in the world had to hold dollars to buy oil. It created an artificial demand for American currency that kept the US economy afloat. China hates this system. They hate that their economy is tethered to the dollar. They want to buy oil in their own currency, the yuan. For years, Saudi Arabia said no. It was too risky. It would anger the Americans too much. But as the relationship deepened, the no turned into a maybe. And that maybe is what scares the Western banking system more than anything. To understand how this shift affects real people, we have to look away from the palaces and the boardrooms. We have to look at the ground level. Consider the story of Ahmed. Ahmed is a mid-level engineer in Yanbu, a massive industrial port city on the Red Sea. For 20 years, his career was defined by American standards. He worked with American machinery, read manuals in English, and reported to managers who were trained in Texas. Then, about 5 years ago, things changed. Ahmed was assigned to a new refinery expansion, a joint venture with a Chinese conglomerate. Suddenly, the crates arriving at the dock weren't from Houston, they were from Shenzhen. The manuals were in Mandarin, with Arabic translations. The American consultants were gone. In their place were teams of Chinese engineers who lived in temporary housing units, working 18-hour days. Ahmed noticed a difference in philosophy. The Americans had always been obsessed with safety protocols and slow, steady progress. The Chinese teams moved with a frantic, terrifying speed. They built infrastructure in months that used to take years. For Ahmed, it was a culture shock, but also a realization. He saw his country pivoting. He saw that the future of his career wasn't in learning English anymore. He started taking night classes to learn basic Mandarin. He realized that the money paying his salary was no longer coming from the West. Then there is the story of Li Wei. Li owns a mid-sized logistics fleet in eastern China. His trucks move electronics from factories to the ports. His entire livelihood depends on the price of diesel. In 2018, during the height of trade tensions, Li almost went bankrupt. Global oil prices spiked and supply chains were disrupted. He spent nights awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he would have to sell his trucks. The uncertainty of the global market, controlled by Western exchanges, was killing his business. When the news of the long-term Saudi-China energy deal broke on state television, Li didn't understand the geopolitics. He didn't care about the petrodollar. What he saw was stability. The deal meant a guaranteed influx of crude oil at stable prices for state refineries. It meant the diesel pumps would keep flowing. For Li, this pact wasn't about world domination, it was about survival. It meant he could promise his drivers they would have jobs next year. These two men, separated by thousands of miles, are the gears in this new machine. One pumps the oil, the other burns it. And for the first time in history, the line connecting them doesn't pass through the United States. So what exactly is in this pact? What did they sign? It is easy to assume it's just a purchase order.
I buy oil, you give cash. But modern statecraft is far more complex. The Saudi-China Pact is a multi-layered ecosystem of agreements that locks the two nations together for decades. First, there is the volume. We're talking about millions of barrels a day secured on long-term contracts. This bypasses the spot market. It means that even if global prices go crazy, China has a baseline supply that is safe. But the real revolution is in the payment infrastructure. Rumors have circulated for years, but now we are seeing the proof: the rise of the Petroyuan. China has launched a crude oil futures contract priced in yuan on the Shanghai International Energy Exchange. They are pushing Saudi Arabia to accept yuan for oil payments. Why does this matter? If Saudi Arabia accepts yuan, China doesn't need to buy US dollars anymore. They can pay with their own printed money. This lowers the value of the dollar and raises the value of the yuan. It allows China to bypass American sanctions. If the US tries to cut China off from the SWIFT banking system, like they did to Russia, China can say, "We don't care, we trade in yuan." It is a financial shield. But Saudi Arabia isn't doing this for charity. They are getting something massive in return: technology and infrastructure. Under the pact, Chinese tech giants like Huawei represent the digital backbone of Saudi Arabia's new economy. While the US banned Huawei, citing spy concerns, Saudi Arabia welcomed them with open arms. They are building 5G networks across the desert. They are building cloud computing centers in Riyadh. They are collaborating on artificial intelligence and surveillance technology. This is the digital Silk Road. Saudi Arabia wants to move away from oil eventually. They want to be a tourism hub, a tech hub, a logistics hub. China is the only country willing to build that infrastructure at a price Saudi Arabia likes. There is also a military component, though it is spoken of in whispers. Historically, the US provided the weapons. But recently, Saudi Arabia has purchased Chinese drones and ballistic missile technology. It's a subtle warning to Washington: if you won't sell us the F-35s, we will buy from the competition. This section of the pact is what keeps Pentagon generals up at night. It's not just about money, it's about interoperability. If Saudi military systems start running on Chinese software, the US military can no longer easily coordinate with them. The security architecture of the Middle East begins to fracture.
The deal also includes nuclear cooperation. China is bidding to build nuclear power plants in the kingdom. Imagine that. American allies running their power grid on Chinese nuclear tech? This is the depth of the integration. It is not a fling. It is a full-blown systemic merger. The ink on the contract was barely dry before the shockwaves hit the region. The most dramatic proof of this new power dynamic wasn't economic, it was diplomatic, and it happened in March 2023. For years, Saudi Arabia and Iran were bitter enemies. They fought proxy wars in Yemen, Syria, and Lebanon. The US tried for decades to manage this conflict, often failing, often taking sides. Then, out of nowhere, an announcement came from Beijing. Saudi Arabia and Iran were restoring diplomatic ties. Who brokered the deal? Not the United Nations, not the United States. It was China. The image of the Saudi and Iranian officials shaking hands, with a Chinese diplomat standing in the middle, was a visual that defined the new century. It sent a clear message: the United States is the agent of chaos and war. China is the agent of stability and business. Whether that is true or not doesn't matter. What matters is the perception. In the Middle East, leaders took note. They saw that China could deliver results that Washington couldn't. This pact has emboldened other nations. We are seeing the expansion of the BRICS alliance: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. They invited Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran to join. Do you see the pattern? It is the formation of a global South bloc, a group of resource-rich nations banding together to create an alternative economy that doesn't answer to the Federal Reserve or the White House. The Saudi-China Pact is the anchor of this new bloc. Saudi has the energy, China has the factories. Together, they are self-sufficient. But what does this mean for the United States? It is a crisis of influence. For decades, if a country wanted to do business in the Middle East, they checked in with the American embassy first. That era is over. The US is still a military giant in the region. They have bases in Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait. But military power is a blunt instrument.
You can't bomb a trade deal. You can't shoot a currency swap. The US is finding that its tools of influence, sanctions, and threats are becoming less effective because the targets now have an alternative backer. If the US threatens to stop selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, Saudi can point to the Chinese catalog. If the US threatens to sanction Saudi banks, Saudi can point to the Shanghai exchange. The monopoly is broken, and the consequences are already rippling out to the average consumer in the West. When inflation hit in 2022 and 2023, the US president asked Saudi Arabia to pump more oil to lower gas prices. It was a standard request. In the old days, Saudi would have said yes, sir. This time, they said no. They cut production. Prices stayed high. They acted in their own interest and the interest of their new partners in OPEC+, which includes Russia. This is the direct result of the pact. Saudi Arabia no longer feels the need to do favors for Washington to ensure its survival. They have diversified their survival portfolio. So, where does this leave us? We are witnessing the end of a unipolar world. For 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union, the US was the only game in town. Now, the board has two sides again. The Saudi-China Oil Pact is not just a business deal. It is a declaration of independence for the Middle East and a declaration of dominance for China. It signifies a future where the US dollar is challenged, where American sanctions lose their bite, and where the most critical resource on the planet, energy, flows east, not west. For the West, this is a wake-up call. The assumption that the Middle East would always be an American gas station is dead. For the rest of the world, it is a time of uncertainty. As these two giants, the US and China, wrestle for control, smaller nations are being forced to choose sides. The handshake that built the 20th century is gone. The signature that will build the 21st century has been inked in Beijing. Money moves fast, but power moves silently until it's too late to stop it. The pact is signed, the pipelines are open, and the world as we knew it has already changed.